Thanks to Beam for sponsoring this video. Hey, what's up? Apple pie is awesome, but making it at home from scratch kinda sucks. It's hard, it's fussy, and very rarely is the final result worth all that hard work. So today, I'm gonna show you how to make a much more approachable variation called a galette. It's still chock full of all the cinnamony apple goo that you want and has tons of flaky, buttery crust, but it's easier, a lot more forgiving, and probably better than apple pie. To get started, I'll grab my food processor and into the jar of that measure 200 grams of all-purpose flour, 20 grams of sugar, and 3 grams of salt. Now the lid goes on and I'll spin this up until everything is well combined. And there we go. Next, I'm gonna add in 150 grams of very cold cubed butter, but not just any butter. This is a high-fat, grass-fed butter from Ireland called Kerrygold, and it has an exceptional grassy, buttery flavor, but regular butter would work totally fine. A quick note is that this high-fat butter has less water in it than regular, and because of that, it gets softer at room temperature much faster. So to make sure this butter is firm enough to cut cleanly into the flour, it needs 10 minutes in the freezer to get firmed up. So now the lid goes on and I'll pulse this food processor 25 to 35 times until the butter is chopped into small pieces that are roughly the size of a grain of rice. Don't over pulse your butter here because that would make a homogeneous pie crust that would be a lot less flaky. Once we've got a nice coarse butter gravel going on like this, I'm gonna grab a scale and measure 65 grams of ice cold water into a container. Next, I'll start combining this by pulsing the food processor every second or so while I stream in the water pretty quickly. Try to get it all in there within 12 to 15 pulses. Too much pulsing and again we go homogeneous here and lose most of the flakiness, and too little it's going to be coarse and not really mixed together. The key here is to get everything combined while also leaving little droplets of cold hard butter spread evenly throughout, and that looks good. It's still sandy and loose but wet enough to hold itself together. A good test is to squeeze a little bit in your hand like this. It should come together into something that's dough-like but still pretty crumbly. Next, I'll lay out a big sheet of plastic wrap and then dump in my sandy buttery dough. From there, I'll come back and give it a squeeze to get things more cohesive and slightly more round and flat. Then I'll close up that pile of dough within the plastic wrap and then round it and flatten it into a shape of something that resembles a large hockey puck, about 6 inches across. Now I need to move this over to the fridge for about an hour to both hydrate the flour and get the butter back to 100% cold. And check out the dough. As you can see, the butter flecks are spread evenly throughout, and that's exactly what we want. 1 hour later, I'll pull my dough out of the fridge so that I can soften it slightly at room temp for easier rollout, and while I'm over here, I'll also preheat my oven to 375F. While that preheats and this dough softens, I'll make the apple filling. For that, I've got 2 medium-large honeycrisp apples here. Not only are honeys the most superb eating apple by far, but they've also got what I think is the perfect balance of acidity and sweetness for pastry. I'll just peel the sides down real quick, and there we go. Pretty apple. Next, I'll cut the sides off this thing, leaving behind the seeds and the core. And from there, I'll slice this somewhere between 1/8 and 1/4 inch thick. We want some girth to the apple slice so they're not mushy when they get cooked, but obviously if we go too thick, they're gonna be overly crunchy and that would also bum me out. In total, we need about 300 grams of sliced honeycrisp apples. Once they're cut, I'll add in 50 grams of white sugar, white over brown because I want the apple flavor to shine more than anything, and brown makes things taste a little bit muddy. Then 15 grams of cornstarch to thicken things up. There we go. Then 2 grams of salt, 2 to 3 grams of cinnamon, and optionally some nutmeg. I'll grate about 1 gram's worth on my microplane to enhance the warm spice of the cinnamon. I don't want to go too heavy with nutmeg though because that would step on the flavor of the apple. Lastly, I'll add in a few drips of lemon juice, only like 5 grams worth. Okay, next I'll jump in to get things combined, and I'll mention don't go too rough on these because they'll macerate and get overly weepy, and obviously I'd prefer to keep all of the apple juice inside of the apple. Once these are all tossed up to combine, I'm going to move them out of the way to hang out for 5 to 10 minutes while I roll out the crust for this galette. But first, let's thank Beam for sponsoring this video. Like most people, I struggle sleeping well from time to time, especially after I've been drinking wine. But when I really struggle with sleeping is after and during travel. Jet lag just totally destroys me. Luckily, Beam Dream has been such a huge help in battling my jet lag that it's become a critical part of my travel routine, and I even packed it for my most recent trip to South Korea. And if you don't know what Beam Dream is, it's a tasty little powder that's clinically shown to help you sleep better with 5 natural sleep promoting ingredients. It comes in flavors like original cinnamon cacao, sea salt caramel, that's my personal favorite, and they've also got other seasonal flavors like white chocolate peppermint. To take it, you just mix the powder into some warm water, drink it before bed, and catch me snoozing, you guys, soundly. Starting today, November 7th, you can get up to 50% off Beam's entire site. Just use my link in the description below and get 50% off your first month subscription and 20% off all of your following orders. Plus, your first order comes with this sick frother. You guys, this is Beam's best offer ever, so you don't want to miss out. I genuinely use this product pretty regularly and I highly recommend it. When I unwrap the dough, you can see that it's softened just enough to be pliable, but it's also still cold and quite firm. To roll it out, I'll hit both sides liberally with flour to keep it from sticking to the board as the butter softens. Then I'll flour my rolling pin and gently lay it down at the halfway mark. From there, I'll push forward with some firm pressure, then go back to the middle and push backward with the same firm press. The move here is to flatten this hockey puck into a sheet, but we need to do that a very little bit at a time to prevent too much cracking and butter smearing. After a 90-degree turn here, I'll repeat that forward press and then a backward one. And if the dough starts to crack around the edges, no big deal. It definitely will. Just use your fingers to press things back together and zhuzh it in the direction you want it to head. In total, it should take 7 to 8 rounds of rolling and turning to get this relatively flattened. And once it's most of the way there, we can switch over to a general rolling move to spread it out into an even flat circle that's about 12 inches wide. Next, I'll use my bench scraper, or something like it, to loosen this galette dough so that it's not stuck to my board. Then, just as if this was a pizza dough, I'm going to flip it onto my right arm and then grab a 12 by 8 wide piece of parchment paper and then carefully lay the dough into the middle of that. It should just barely be hanging off the 12-inch side. Next, I'm going to grab my rolling pin one more time and then roll this about a ½ inch to an inch more in each direction. And I'll also mention that at this point, I'm using very little downward pressure so that I don't crack the crust or smear the butter. Too much downward force and we would flatten all those flecks of butter that we worked so hard to get earlier. And there we go. It's roughly 13 to 14 inches across now, so let's get to work with the apples. The first move is to lay these apples out in a ring around the outside about 2 to 3 inches from the edge of the pastry. By the way, the following semi-meticulous apple procedure can be totally skipped in lieu of just piling things up in the middle. The results will be a little bit more rustico, but taste exactly the same. Once we've got a nice ring of apples laid around the outside here, I'll come back and shingle some additional apples going perpendicular to the original ring. I'm stacking these in the same direction with the peeled part facing out. That way we get a pretty fan spiral situation going on. This step is actually pretty therapeutic too. Feels kind of like putting together a puzzle on a rainy day. Very relaxing. Once the outer ring is shingled and arranged tightly like this, I'll layer 3 slices flat in the middle to prop up the inner ring, and then I'll repeat the same shingling process as before. And once I've got 2 rows of tidy apples like this, I'll lay a 3 to 4 piece rosette right in the middle to cover up any space that might be left over. And there we go, a beautiful spiral of cinnamon sugar apples. Now to finish this thing, I'm going to grab a flap of the rolled crust and fold it over the first row of apples. I'll repeat that, making a little pleat every 3 to 4 inches. Then I'll move over, do it again, and a little pressure to seal the fold each time. There should be no space between the outer ring of apples and the folded dough, by the way. That's going to create a really nice pocket of melty apples under the crust later on, and it might possibly be the best bite of the entire thing. Once we're all closed up, I'll come back and zhuzh this a bit to make sure it's pretty and looking circular. Looking good so far, and then to get this ready to bake, I'll brush it with some egg wash. Oop! By the way, this egg wash is just 1 egg and a little splash of water stirred with a fork until it's not lumpy. Once I've got a generous dose wiped all around the edges here, I'm going to cover that wash with a bunch of crunchy demerara sugar, or sugar in the raw. This is going to bring a ton of texture to the crust and really play off of the crust's flakiness. Plus, it kind of caramelizes lightly when it gets baked and brings some additional depth of flavor. Next, I'll drizzle in 3 to 4 tablespoons of the cinnamony cornstarch slurry that was left behind from the apples, because I really want to make sure that these apples get set in a nice gel once they're cooled, and to do that I need cornstarch. Next, a few strong pinches of flaky Maldon salt, because salty sweet is better than sweet sweet. Then I'll add in 3 to 4 thin pads of butter right on top for some extra richness. Once this is all tidied up into a beautiful little package like this, I'm going to lift this parchment paper and drop it onto a sheet pan, and then from there load it into a preheated 375F oven to bake for 40 to 50 minutes. As this bakes, it's really cool to see all the water in those little flecks of butter turn to steam and puff this pastry. That's a literal visual representation of flakiness being created. Halfway through, I'll come back and turn this 180 to ensure even baking, then another 20 to 25 minutes of baking until the apples are tender and roasted and the crust is a medium golden brown. After 45 minutes in total, when I pull this out, you can see this really looks like something that you want to be a part of. It's beautifully round, it's well baked, and the apples are looking really delicious. The crust is perfectly cooked and burnished with crunchy raw sugar, and oh, the flaky salt survived too. I can't wait to crunch on that. My favorite part is the crust that's full of gooey, tender apples. It's It's gonna be an amazing bite. Now to serve this, I'll drop this still warm galette into a bowl and then top it with some well-softened vanilla ice cream to bring a little melty sauciness. And for all intents and purposes, this is pie. But it's probably better because it has a higher crust to filling ratio than pie, which for me is very desirable. This galette, on the other hand, is buttery, flaky, gooey, and best of all, very easy to make. Anyone can do it, and I really hope you try it soon. Let's eat this thing. If you guys struggle with sleep, check out Beam's holiday sale with the link in my description below to save up to 50%.